The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
Welcome to Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association, connecting Virginians to their government. And welcome to Senator Tim Kaine, one of 20 people in American history who has served as mayor, governor, and now United States Senator. In addition, the first senator to give a floor speech entirely in Spanish. Welcome, sir.
Hey, Woody, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
Tell us a little bit about your experience in the U.S. Senate versus your experience as governor and mayor.
Well, Woody, it's an interesting contrast, and one of the things that people often say is that governors turn out to be like the least happy senators, because yes, when you're a governor or a mayor, whatever the pyramid, you're kind of at the top of the pyramid, and then you come into the Senate, as I did. I was 95th in seniority out of 100, and they put you in a basement office for 6 months until they give you a regular office. So there's some who are unhappy in the Senate, but what I learned from my friend Mark Warner, and we've been friends for 35 years, as he talked about his experiences in the Senate, even before I went in, I decided, you know, it's not an executive job. Executive jobs are fun, but it's not an executive job. It's an expertise job. So pick a couple of areas that you're passionate about and focus on them, and that's a path to being a productive senator, but also being a happy one. And I'll tell you that is the thing about the Senate I really like. When you're a mayor or governor, you have to pay attention to everything. So it's state parks, and 5 minutes later it's the state police, and then it's, you know, an issue dealing with social services or economic development. In the Senate, with 100 senators each picking their own specialties, I focus on just a couple of things. Armed services. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, so making sure our defense is strong, but also I look a lot at issues dealing with the veterans' unemployment rate. Foreign relations. I'm really lucky to be on that committee, dealing with our diplomacy and trade relations to the world. And I look at Latin America and the Middle East, and I try to specialize in those parts of the world. And then finally, I'm on the Budget Committee, and because I've done a lot of budgeting as a mayor and governor, and the federal budget process has really been dysfunctional, I go and try to help fix and make it more normal. So I just pick a couple of issues and really focus, and so I've actually enjoyed it quite a bit in 2 years.
Now, in terms of foreign relations, one of the ways you've had to educate yourself is through travel internationally. Talk
Indeed.
To us a little bit about that.
Well, I kind of talked my way onto the Foreign Relations Committee because I'm fluent in Spanish. I had lived in Honduras for a year and worked as a missionary there in 1980 and 81. But then about 6 months after I got on the committee, I was appointed the chairman of the subcommittee overseeing the Middle East, all of Arab North Africa and the entire Middle East. And I had traveled there a couple of times, once as mayor and once as governor, but obviously there are many countries where I had not been. So over the course of my first 2 years in the Senate, I spent a good bit of time going to visit our troops overseas in Afghanistan, but also, you know, Israel and in North Africa, in Jordan, in Qatar. Qatar is where the current air campaign against ISIL is being managed, and I went to see Virginians there. And that's an important way to educate myself, but also I love being able to go and find the American men and women who are serving, whether they're in the military or they're serving in an embassy position somewhere, to be able to go and find them and thank them for the work that they do, and then learn from them has really helped me do my job.
Now, we're well into the 114th Congress. Talk to us about some of your priorities.
My priorities focus a lot around my committees. So on armed services, look, we've got a lot of military challenges in the world. And one of the areas where I'm really focused right now is the military campaign against ISIL. I think ISIL poses a major threat to the world and to the United States. And I support the President's decision in early August to say we need to take military action against ISIL. But I've battled with the President. I'm normally, you know, on his side, but I've kind of battled with him about, but you shouldn't be doing this without a vote of Congress. And actually, who I've really battled with is Congress, because Congress, on a matter as controversial as war, sometimes doesn't want to cast a vote. They would rather allow the President to act and criticize the president even, but not cast a vote themselves as to whether they think a military action is a good or bad thing. And so a strong priority of mine in this session is to not be at war. We're now in the 7th month of a war, not be at war without a congressional vote. And so I'm pushing Congress to actually have a war authorization against ISIL. I drafted one up, and we were able to have a vote on it in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in December, but it didn't get a floor vote, and there's been no discussion or voting on the House side. So that's an important and immediate priority. The second priority that's a real immediate one is the budget. The federal budget, because of a vote of Congress before I came in August of 2011, has been under the sequester, where there's just mandatory across-the-board cuts. Not cuts based on judgment about what's a good thing to cut or a bad thing, or what programs are performing well or not, just kind of across-the-board cuts. That's the worst way to do budgeting. I learned as a mayor and a governor, everything isn't worth everything else. If you're going to make cuts, and I had to make a lot of them as a governor, you look and you see which programs are performing well and which aren't. And then you try to make priority judgments. Some things are more important than others. So I'm trying to work within the Budget Committee to replace the across-the-board sequester cuts with a more targeted strategy that doesn't weaken our defense or weaken other core priorities, but still helps us deal with a debt that's at $17 trillion and rising. Because of the Senate calendar, we're supposed to finish a budget, and this would be for the budget that would begin in October of 2015, but we're supposed to finish the budget by the end of March. And so we're on a pretty fast timetable right now to do a budget, but to do it in a way that I think is better for the Commonwealth, better for the country. So those are two immediate priorities: getting Congress to vote finally about this war on ISIL, and then doing a budget that doesn't cut core priorities in a way that's foolish.
Let's circle back to the action against ISIL, because there is a current authorization for use of military force. I take it you don't think that's pertinent?
That's correct, Woody. The Congress passed an authorization right after the attack of 9/11 saying basically we're going to go after the perpetrators of the 9/11 attack. ISIL was not formed until 2 years after 9/11. So I think the White House has sort of relied on that authorization, and I think that's clearly not what Congress contemplated. Second, Congress passed an authorization to go to war in Iraq in 2002. But that was a war to topple the government of Iraq, the Saddam Hussein government of Iraq. Well, now we're in supporting the government of Iraq against this terrorist organization whose headquarters are really in Syria, in Raqqa, Syria, and then they're coming over the border into Iraq. And so I don't think that authorization covers this action at all either. And so I've been very sharp about this really since June of 2013, 2 months before the president went into this battle against ISIL. It was pretty clear that military action would be needed, and I've been arguing that if we're going to take military action, we need to get Congress on board. And the reason I care so much about this is not just that the Constitution says it will be Congress that will declare war, but in Virginia we're more connected to the military than any other state. 1 out of 9 Virginians is a veteran, and then we have all these military installations, and so many who serve in the active duty or the Guard and Reserve, or they're DOD contractors like nurses at the hospital up at Fort Belvoir, or they're DOD contractors, so like shipbuilders down in the Port of Hampton Roads at the Newport News shipyard, and then all military families. We're so connected to the military. I just don't think it's moral to ask people to risk their lives in a war if Congress isn't willing to at least debate and say this is worthwhile. If we're not going to do the job to debate and say this is worthwhile, well, how dare we ask people to risk their lives? And we've already lost a handful of American service members in what's called Operation Inherent Resolve. That's the current military mission against ISIL. And I just don't think we ought to be asking people to sacrifice if we won't do the job to have the debate and say, this is a mission that's worth your sacrifice.
There's always been this tension between the president, who's commander-in-chief, and the Congress, who you indicate has the obligation to declare war. And there is the War Powers Act, and I know you've been active on that front as well. Talk to us about that tension.
Yeah, the tension is there, but the framers, it's interesting. If you look at the Constitution, you could look at the Constitution and kind of put the provisions of the Constitution into 2 buckets. Provisions that are super clear. You have to be 35 years old to be President of the United States. Very clear. And then provisions that are kind of vague. You know, there won't be, you can't administer cruel and unusual punishment. What's cruel and unusual punishment? Or you're entitled to due process of law. Well, what's due process of law? So there are the vague provisions and the clear ones. The war powers piece are actually very clear. Article 1 says it will be up to Congress to declare war, and it will also be up to Congress to allocate budgetarily to fund military operations. Article 2, the article dealing with the President, says the President is the Commander-in-Chief. And the framers wrote a series of letters back and forth about what that meant. And basically, what it meant was this: to initiate any war, you've got to have Congress. The President's role, but once a war is initiated, it's the President that manages it. The last thing you need is 535 people trying to manage it. The only circumstance under which a President can act before Congress is to defend the nation. So if there's an immediate attack and you've got to defend, or an imminent attack and you have to defend, the President can act first to defend, but then the President's supposed to then go back to Congress and say, now, you know, say that this was the right thing to do. So it's really clear. Well, when the President started this particular campaign against ISIL in August, he had a defense rationale. ISIS was moving toward the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and to a consulate in Erbil. But after about a couple weeks, that was solved. And then he said, now it's time to go on offense against ISIL. We need to wage a war against ISIL. And they started to do bombing campaigns that were unrelated to protecting American lives. And they even said they didn't have any intelligence suggesting that ISIL was intending to attack the United States or our embassy. So at that point, when you go on offense, you're supposed to get Congress to weigh in. And it was James Madison who drafted this part of the Constitution. In letters that he wrote back and forth to Thomas Jefferson, they made plain this was the allocation of power. Thomas Jefferson, early in his presidency, he faced a challenge with the Barbary Coast Pirates. It was like the terrorist organization of the day. And what he realized is every time the pirates attacked a United States ship, he could order that it be defended without Congress. But one day he decided, you know, I'm tired of just repelling one attack after the next. We ought to go after them and try to defeat them so they can't attack us. And he said, when we needed to go on offense, that's when I need Congress. And the same rule should hold today. Presidents need to be able to defend the country, but when you've got to go on offense to take out a threat, whether it's a state or a terrorist organization, like the Barbary Coast Pirates or ISIL, you've got to get Congress on board.
So do you think there will finally be a vote on ISIL?
I do. I think the President is going to send up an authorization. He committed to doing this finally in the State of the Union 2 weeks back, and I think he'll send up an authorization. And what do you know, the way this works is the President will send up a draft, and we'll have hearings about it in the Foreign Relations Committees in both houses. It's interesting that a declaration of war doesn't go through the Armed Services Committee. It goes through the Foreign Relations Committee, sort of, because you want to make sure that it's the kind of the diplomatic committee that's looking to see, okay, do we need to engage in war, or is there a diplomatic alternative that we haven't exhausted? Well, with ISIL, there isn't a diplomatic alternative that would work. So you will see that debate. There will be some differences of opinion about some details, like should we use American ground troops? I think that would be a mistake. Others think it may be necessary. Exactly how do you define the mission, especially in Syria, where it's very difficult right now because of the Syrian civil war? There will be some differences of opinion. But on balance, right now, I would say about 3/4 of the members of Congress strongly believe that we do need to engage in military action to try to defeat this threat, which is spreading across the globe and creating foreign fighters and adherents who are perpetrating human rights atrocities like the shooting in France, a few weeks back. So I think there's going to be broad support after we work through some details.
Let's talk a little bit more about sequestration, those across-the-board cuts, because they have a major impact on the Commonwealth, of course. We've got 44 military installations in the Pentagon spread throughout the state of Virginia. The legislature here is wrestling with the budget in fear of what may happen again in Washington, D.C. Talk to us a little bit about that again and how you think things will pan out in Washington this year.
Well, it's a challenge, and it's a tough one. I know that my friends here in the state legislature, they're very worried about it. At the same time, they are often saying you need to reduce the federal budget, you need to reduce the debt and deficit, and we do. We have a $17 trillion debt. So we have to find ways to bring that more under control. When I came to the Senate hadn't done a budget in 4 years. I got put on the Senate Budget Committee, and then we did a Senate budget within my first 90 days in the Senate. It ended up being a 2-year budget, which is a good thing. We stole a page from the state budget, made it a 2-year budget. But what we have to do is deal with the debt, but deal with it in ways that are smart, not stupid. Again, if you just do across-the-board cuts, you basically are saying, well, everything's worth everything else, and everybody should take the same cut. Well, we just know that that's not true. You know, we don't need to cut cybersecurity. We should be putting more money into cybersecurity. You know, this recent North Korea cyber attack shows that it would be foolish to reduce cybersecurity by the same, you know, exact percentage as some other item of government. We probably shouldn't be reducing the funds we spend on medical research. We've cut medical research dramatically in the last 6 or 7 years. We should probably be spending more, because we can find cures that will ease human suffering, but will also save us money in our healthcare budget. So my goal is, on sequestration, to figure out a way to get rid of it, but to do a credible deficit reduction strategy that that is based on, you know, really careful analysis of priorities. This is what I had to do when I was governor. You know, I'm the only governor. This is not an achievement that I wish on anybody else. I'm the only governor in Virginia history who left office with a smaller budget than when I started. That was because I was governor during the worst recession since the 1930s, and I had to make a lot of cuts. But I can assure you, we didn't just give everybody the same percentage number. What we did is we made them produce plans, and then we went through the plans in detail and decided, yep, this can be cut, this can be reduced. But we increased the funding for early childhood education so that 40% more kids had the opportunity to be in early childhood programs. So some things we eliminated, some things we cut, some things we left the same, some things we increased. The net effect of it was a significant reduction. But we did it, you know, program by program, case by case. It takes a lot of work. It's very difficult to do. But if you just do the across the boards, you know, you end up hurting areas that I think will come back and bite you. So I'm trying to find that, you know, alternative in the budget work that I'm doing right now.
Does it help at the state level that there's a constitutional requirement to balance the budget as opposed to the federal?
It does, and that's the right rule for the states. It's the right rule for cities, but it's the country needs to be able to do what it does. You know, there's been a long tradition, not only in the United States, but other federal, national budgets as well, of being able to do deficit spending in critical times. If you couldn't do that, we wouldn't have won World War II. If you couldn't have done that, we might not have built the interstate highway system that President Eisenhower championed in the 1950s. And having some level of debt is okay. It's just the amount of debt. Look, the state has debt.
Right.
You know, we may have a balanced budget, but we have plenty of debt. When we build highways, when we build buildings on college campuses, we have debt. The question is, you know, how much debt service are you paying every year as a percentage of your budget? What's your total debt compared to your state or federal domestic product, GDP? So you try to manage your debt the right way. The United States is not far out of whack in terms of debt to GDP ratio right now, but the challenge is this, and it's a good challenge to have. We're living longer, and because we're living longer, programs like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security are more and more expensive as we live longer. And if we don't do anything different about the federal budget in 10 years, our debt to GDP ratio will be unacceptable. So, you know, we've got to figure out a smart way to deal with that.
Now, are you optimistic about the ability of Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill to compromise on certain issues this Congress?
I am. On certain issues, that's the key. I mean, I think, you know, there may be a prediction, oh, there's 2 Republican houses and now there's a Democratic president, so it'll be gridlock. I actually see some important areas where we will be able to work together. And because as governor, you know, I had to work with 2 Republican houses my first 2 years, and I've built up a good track record in the Senate for working across the aisle. Like the legislation that I've been able to get passed so far has all been with Republican co-sponsors. I can see a couple of areas. We ought to be able to, the one we talked about, we ought to be able to authorize this military action against ISIL with appropriate limitations in a bipartisan way. Infrastructure. Our nation needs repairs of our bridges, highways, upgrades to our rail system and ports, and we're going to do it at some point. Do we do it now? Do we do it 10 years from now? Well, interest rates are really low now. So if you're going to fix infrastructure, do it when interest rates are low. The President has recently proposed a significant infrastructure program. There are some bills pending in the Senate, including one that Senator Warner has championed, an infrastructure bank. This is a classic example of something that we ought to be able to do, Democrats and Republicans. Woody, I'm also optimistic that we will get an immigration reform bill done before 2016. I was very happy to work with a bipartisan group of senators in 2013 to pass an immigration bill. We passed it in June of 2013, and the House has not even taken action in any committee about it. But when you have, you know, the Chamber of Commerce and civil rights organizations and the Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Farm Bureau and the technology industry and everybody saying it's time to do immigration reform, it's a nonpartisan issue. The American public supports the notion of a comprehensive immigration reform bill. We ought to be able to find a path to do that.
Now, one of the first bills you introduced and was passed successfully was the Troop Talent Act. Tell us why that was so important, especially to our veterans.
I introduced my first bill in April of 2013. I've been in the Senate 3 or 4 months, and Troop Talent Act. And basically, you know, what the bill does is it focuses on the problem of veteran unemployment. Iraq and Afghan war vets for many years have had a high, especially enlisteds, have had a higher unemployment rate than the national average. Right now it's kind of back down to average, but it had been spiked up pretty high. And that's just wrong. You know, we can't ask people to go and serve multiple tours and then come back and they struggle to get connection with the civilian job market. So I determined, based on listening to veterans tell their stories, that one of the reasons for this is that the civilian workforce doesn't understand what it is to be in the military these days. Only 1% of people serve in the military. So
1%.
1%. So of the adult population. So if you're a gunnery sergeant in the Marine Corps, or you're an E5, you know, in the Navy, you get out of the military, you go to a civilian workforce and you say, I was a gunnery sergeant in the Marine Corps. Well, it used to be when people were subject to draft that somebody would understand, okay, I basically know the kind of leadership training you have, the kinds of things that you've done, the skills that you might have. But when only 1% of the adult workforce has been in the military, I think a lot of our veterans go into places to get hired and people are like, we're glad you served, but we don't have any idea what you bring to the table. So the idea is, when you're in military, let's get the civilian credential that matches the skill you learn at the moment you learn it, put that in your personnel file, and whether you leave the military a year from now or 20 years from now, you will have that credential. You're operating heavy equipment. Get a commercial driver's license. You're at the ordnance school down at Fort Lee and you're learning metalworking training. Get the certificate from the American Welding Society. You're a cook in the military. Get a Culinary Institute of America certification. So many military specialties now rely on technology. Take technology exams. And do it right when you're at your peak of learning, so that when you leave, you go to a place of employment and it's not just I was a gunny sergeant in the Marine Corps, but look at all these skills that I have, look at all these credentials I have that you understand. And so this is what the Troop Talent Act was about, was to build within the DoD an expectation that everybody who serves in the military should be getting the civilian credential or credit to match what they're learning at the moment they learn it, to make it easier for them to find jobs. And I have found this to be warmly embraced by the military. And in fact, just about 10 days ago, a panel that had been put together to make recommendations about military compensation and benefits, they made 15 recommendations, and one of them was about this very thing. We need to build on the work that's already been done, but make sure that those in the military are getting the credentials and skills that the civilian workforce understands, so that we can enable them to transition more smoothly. We owe it to them for their service, but also as a society. Once we've invested so heavily in giving people these skills and training, we can benefit from those skills for the rest of their lives. These are our future leaders and scientists and business leaders, you know, future academics, police officers, teachers. We ought to be benefiting from their experience because we've invested in them. We'll be a richer nation if we do.
Yeah, that seems to work hand in hand with a program at the state level where returning veterans can get credit at the junior community college level for experience they've had overseas.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And now there are some military specialties where the transition is is easier. The guys, it's interesting, at Fort Lee, somebody told me, yeah, we have what's called the logistician's revenge. I said, well, what is that? They said, well, when we're in the military, the guys who do the logistical stuff don't get some of the same attention. But when we get ready to leave, our skills translate really easily in the civilian workforce. If you're an infantryman, you know, that translation to the civilian workforce is a little bit more challenging. But you know, the incredible team ethic and the leadership skills and the problem-solving abilities, the ability to react quickly to change circumstances. You know, I'm just so impressed every time I go, whether it's to a base here or whether I see Virginians overseas. You know, this is a generation that has really got some amazing skills, and we owe it to them and we owe it to ourselves to enable them to connect back into the civilian workforce as quickly as they can when they decide that they want to make the transition away from military service.
That also fits well with your career and technical education caucus that you and I think Rob Portman initiated.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Woody. I'm not on the education committee in the Senate. You know, one of the things they tell you when you go to the Senate is you ask for committees. You know, I asked Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, a Republican would ask Mitch McConnell, and they say you will get a committee you want, you won't get a committee you want, and you'll get a committee you don't want. And the committee I wanted that I didn't get was the education committee. I didn't get put on that committee. I asked, and I can't complain because I'm on good committees. But what I did is I looked at the committee and I said, what educational issues are not being championed by anyone now? And I decided, even if I'm not on the committee, I'm going to pick up an issue and champion it. And nobody was really focused on career and technical education. I grew up in a house where my dad ran an ironworking and welding shop, and my brothers and I and my mother all worked in my dad's business. And I got to know these great ironworkers and welders who really were craftsmen. And then I ran a school in Honduras in 1980 and 81 with missionaries to teach kids to be carpenters and welders. I've always believed passionately in career and technical education. When I was governor, we started career and technical academies around the state that Governor McDonald continued and grew, and now Governor McAuliffe is continuing and growing. So I went to Rob Portman, who's from Ohio, and Tammy Baldwin, who is from Wisconsin, and the three of us said, let's start a career and technical education caucus to do good policy, to educate senators and their staffers about the power of career and technical education, to recommend not only legislation but even to the White House, hey, you can do A, B, or C. I was happy when the President recently announced his proposal for if you can be a good student to try to get free community college tuition the first years. He said at a community college or career and technical program. He included career and technical education in, which presidents in the past have often not done that. But in Virginia, as you know, we've got some great examples. The shipbuilding apprenticeship program at the Huntington Ingalls Shipyard in Newport News might be just about the best career and technical program in the United States.
Well, great. Thank you for being here, Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat of Virginia.
Thank you, Woody.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association, connecting Virginians to their government. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.
Mm-hmm.